Hello and welcome to the Bridging Research Protocols and Healthcare Systems talk. My name is Geoff Low. I'm from Medidays Solutions, which is a Dassault system company, but I'm primarily here from the perspective of my co-chair role as part of the Vulcan SOA working group. Those of you who were lucky enough to join Hugh's talk yesterday would have been given sort of an overview of all the topics that are underway, which are all kind of all heading in the same direction. This is one of sort of the longer running projects. It was kind of built on top of some earlier work that was being done through another organization called FHIR, which is a industry working group collaboration on the biopharma side. I've been involved in that many years. The actual FHIR interest in this group has been actually running since 2016 or thereabouts. And there's been a number of different sort of stages of the project, looking at picking up data and putting it into an EDC system, publishing it straight into STTM as an example, and many other things. So I'm a principal innovation scientist with Medidata. I've been there for over 10 years. EHR is mostly an interest project for me, but it's something that I ultimately see is going to be really transformative, because obviously in the past there's been kind of this strange wall between the two systems, the healthcare systems, the research systems. I think that wall is coming down. I think FHIR is the man with the jackhammer at the bottom of that wall. So what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to give some overview on what clinical research is. I'm not going to lay it on too thick because there's plenty of material out there. There was a Vulcan 101 project, which had a really good overview of some of the stuff. You should be able to find the video for that online. I'm going to focus specifically on our topic of interest, which is around the schedule of activities. So what is a schedule of activities? What's its relevance? How is it going to be important? And then I'm going to go through our actual working group proposal for the implementation of a schedule of activities using FHIR resources. And then I'm actually going to go through a walkthrough in terms of taking some data that we put into a FHIR server and then following our algorithm through to actually be able to go and identify resources that could be associated with a clinical study. And then I'm just going to give some sort of brief overview, some brief thoughts on what it is we've achieved, what we want to be able to do, and where we think it's going to be the most relevant moving forward. Because primarily what is clinical research? It's mechanically it's the activity of gathering evidence to prove that an intervention is suitable for marketing use for adverse conditions. So the intervention doesn't traditionally you just think of, for example, a drug. Intervention is not kind of constrained to that. Intervention is any sort of exercise you would do or intervention you would do with an individual to mitigate their circumstances based on a condition and everything like that. And then I've used that term suitable, and I wanted to sort of dig in a little bit on that. So suitable is there's a number of different definitions for the ones, but I tend to navigate towards the two main ones, these three main topics. So efficacious. So does the actual intervention work? Does it lead to positive outcomes for individuals who are experiencing intervention? Safe. Is there a minimal adverse event or adverse reactions from the use of the intervention? And obviously that's on a continuum, because some people are very sick. And so you are in a position to weigh up the adverse outcomes to say whether it's sort of on the long term, whether it's actually something that can be tolerated or not, and of value. There's a lot of, excuse the expression, Me Too drugs that come onto the market in terms of the small sort of iterations around a compound. But you need to be able to prove that your new formulation, your new iteration itself is actually providing value, because in today's world where money's relatively short, you want to be able to prove that there's a value-based argument for your intervention. In some cases, like the UK, the value is very highly prized. So if you can't prove it's of value, you won't get it past NICE, and NICE won't approve it for marketing or make it available. So the act of clinical research is actually gathering data that supports these goals effectively. I'm just going to talk very briefly around these, but so these are some of the sort of key actors, components that are involved in clinical research. So at the top, there's a clinical development program, and the clinical development program is essentially the intersection between an intervention or a compound specifically or generally and a particular condition. So you don't, like, a lot of what's done at the moment is that people think about studies, but a study is not necessarily what gets submitted to the regulatory agents themselves, and of themselves. You actually take a number of studies all the way through from like initial sort of safety investigations through to the point of actually therapeutic use. And all of that, all the data for that gets bound together under like a business description of a clinical development program, and the data gets compiled into a submission. So a submission to the regulatory agency is actually a combination of data from many, many studies. A clinical trial protocol is a document that's describing a study, an individual investigation. And by and large, it's a mechanism for providing hypothesis and providing evidence, or providing the elements you would want to follow to prove that out. Clinical trial CTMS is a system that's used, electronic system that's used to track the collection of and record the actual data itself that's gathered as part of a clinical trial. These are also sometimes called EDC system or electronic data capture systems, but they would also go back to like pre-EDC, where you talk about things like where people were faxing forms in and entering them directly into a database. A study site is effectively the intersection of a location and an investigator. An investigator is the person who's ultimately medically responsible at a site for the identification, the treatment, and the follow-up of the research subjects themselves. Site coordinator is another member of staff at the site itself who generally take on most of the load with respect to the data entry itself. So these are the sort of people that investigate. The investigator is good to get on site with the eSource. Site coordinator is even better because they're the ones whose job is going to be impacted the most by this. And then the research subject, who is the key. It's a clinical trial participant. It's somebody who's volunteered to take part in a study, to collect or contribute their body and their life to the understanding of whether or not a compound works. So they're the key to all of this. But today we're going to drill into a specific part of the clinical trial protocol, namely the schedule of activities. And the schedule of activities is effectively a plan for how we're going to execute the process of data collection within the study. If you boil it right down, it's something like what we see on the screen. We have a series of episodes or encounters at which there's going to be an engagement between a study participant and an investigator or site coordinator or any of those sorts of people. And there's a series of activities that are going to take place at those events. And they're quite often presented almost exactly like this in the protocol. There's a lot more information, obviously, so some of the activities themselves are relatively simple in terms of they're not multi-layered. Some of them are actually quite sort of complex. But the idea behind this is to basically allow people to understand what's going to happen and approximately when it's going to happen. And this is effectively, or a manifestation of this is what goes into your CTMS system. It's what goes into your reporting requirements. It's what goes into your data collection artifice to define contracts as to when data is going to be, what data is going to be provided to you and when it's going to be provided. Now, how do we actually like move from something like this, which is rendered in a number of representations within the CTMS systems? The CDISC ODM is one that we talk about on our sort of our draft implementation guide. But how do we take this and actually transform it into something that that we could use within a FHIR system itself? So obviously, in most things, workflow is key. So we've been looking again sort of primarily towards the action of like how do we initiate these activities, and how do we like get the results of those? Because ultimately the research itself is relatively myopic in terms of it. In the past, it has been relatively naive to the process of actually collecting the data. like the process of like scheduling activities, getting the subjects into the sites, actually having the procedures run at the given time. So a lot of that stuff has been a wee bit hidden away, and this is one of the things that I'm so fascinated about this approach using FHIR, is we can be much more involved in this process, which has a lot of benefits, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the schedule activity is mostly a definitional artifact. It's mostly used as a data contract. If you boil it right down, it's basically the mechanism by which forms have fields on them, because that's how a lot of our research is conducted. And one of the opportunities, obviously, with this, if we can implement the full clinical trial workflow using FHIR resources and FHIR workflow resources, is we can get much more information about how the activities themselves are being conducted. So once we've done it, so this is kind of this is where we started. So we know that a lot of what we have seen is basically outcomes of events. So what it gets entered into a CRF is an outcome of an event. So that's the thing that our sponsors are primarily interested in. But we also need to understand how we can actually get to that point of that outcome being generated and recorded. So what we've done is we've taken the existing FHIR resources, and this was a big thing for our project. We wanted to be able to prove out that we could actually model the schedule of activities using FHIR resources without having to apply extensions. Because obviously, as soon as we have to start applying extensions, it becomes a wee bit harder to sell to people. The idea is we wanted to use the existing resources themselves and be able to kind of map out how we want things to occur. So obviously at the very top of this, we have the research study, which is a resource that's pretty well understood within FHIR itself. And there's essentially a predicate that's called protocol, which is appointed to a plan definition. Now, we could actually have the predicate going directly. So in this case here, we've basically created a nested plan definition. So we have a single plan definition that includes all the child plan definitions, where a child plan definition would correspond to an encounter. So if you remember, the schedule of activities is rows and columns. The columns themselves, each of the columns within the schedule of activities would correspond to a plan definition. And then within that column, all the activities that you're going to do as part of that study or part of that particular encounter is going to be defined using activity definitions. So we've been primarily focused on sort of the left here in terms of can we get from the concept of a research study down to actually ideally down to the point where we can actually define the activities that are going to occur or the procedures that are going to occur based on that. Why do we want to do this? Well, we obviously want to get down to this point here. So the stuff that's going to be used for actually, or the evidence that provides or reinforces our hypothesis or otherwise is based on observations or diagnostic reports or some sort of outcome measure or resource in this particular case. So we need to work out how we can get all the way from here, research study, all the way down to the observation, because that's ultimately the result. And what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to do it in a structured way, because we don't want to have to spend a lot of time fishing for this stuff. We want to be able to say, okay, this begets this, begets this, begets this. So we have a flow of doing this. Now, there's a couple of approaches. So one of the reasons that this is quite interesting is people want to be able to identify data that's captured as part of a study. And there's a couple of ways you could do that using FHIR. So you could define an extension for these resources and add little annotations to each of the resources or the outcome resources that are associated with a particular study. So if I did a vital signs as part of a protocol, I could do a search for all the observations that are associated with a particular research study itself. And that's a perfectly fine and realistic way of doing it. I'm sort of more of the I like the provenance seems more interesting to me in a lot of these cases. So I want to be able to say, okay, I want to know that this particular observation is associated with my study. How can I follow it through? Well, I can start with a research study. I can look at the protocol element, and the protocol elements can define one or more plan definitions, and the plan definitions are going to define a series of activity definitions. But we know when we actually, assuming we can implement the FHIR workflow, we know that these definitional elements can be actually manifested as like executables or performed elements themselves. So the manifestation of a plan definition is a care plan. So what we're saying here is we can define a plan definition for our study, or for the activities within our study, or the encounters within our study, and we can generate a care plan for each of these elements. And then we can follow this predicate all the way down to get, okay, we are looking for a particular activity associated with the plan definition. We look for the care plan that's based on that plan definition. We can then find a service request created as part of that care plan, or a procedure or a task, and then look at the outcome of that service request or observation to see the end result effectively. So that's kind of our implementation, and it's very easy to draw with boxes, and we've done a lot of drawing with boxes. It doesn't mean anything unless you can actually turn that into an implementation, because if we were just interested in drawing boxes, we could go back to like HL7B3, have a lot of boxes on the screen and be very pleased and happy. But we need to make sure that we can actually manifest this as something that people can use to effectively walk the tree all the way down. I did kind of skip out this one little bit. So a care plan is not just based on a plan definition. It's also patient level, patient or associated with the patient. So it's kind of this cross section between these two things. Well, the patient themselves can't be like, or generally aren't directly bound to a research study. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them would be, for example, there would be data that would be like personally identifiable on the patient resource, as an example. And we want to try and have like a buffer between that and the research subjects themselves, because that's really bad in the conduct of a study. If it's possible for a sponsor to find out who a patient was, that can lead to really big problems. So we have this research subject buffer that sits between the study and the patient, that allows us to do these queries to find things out. So we can actually like tie it all together. So we don't necessarily even need to have maybe the patient itself. We can just have, you need to know what the patient identifier is, and then we can find everything else down the tree. So the way we've put it together is, obviously, I sort of glanced over it. We have effectively a parent entity, and the parent entity itself is a plan definition. And then we have a series of child entities, and we want to be able to say, okay, how can we link these child activities together? And the way we can do that is using the related action predicate. So we can define a set of activities. So it may be like we talked about the protocol, which is talking about a series of planned encounters that are going to occur as part of the study, but they can also be used at the point of actually within an encounter to define the sets of the activities that are going to be performed as part of that. So we can use at a very high level, and pretty well, to be perfectly honest, the related action to kind of satisfy their requirement, insofar as we can actually then go and say, we have all the activity, we know when the activity is going to occur, and we can actually define interims between them, because the actions themselves have like a relationship aspect to them. It's not everything. So we have a lot of, what I'm going to show in a bit is based on some sample data that was generated using CEDAS Pilot, which is a data set that was donated by Lily many years ago for the process of actually validating the ability to generate SDTM data sets and ADAM data sets and everything like that, the whole kit and caboodle. So we have that as our exemplar. We actually have like anonymized data that was actually recorded as part of a clinical study, and that's the sample data set that we use. We do know that there are other things that we need to kind of like embellish that with. So there's a concept of unscheduled activities. So we know that if we were to just look at very simply at the grid, we can see that one activity leads to another activity, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also kind of a reactive element to clinical studies where you have unscheduled activities, which allow you to have like a reactive state where you would say, for example, if lab results were out of whack, or if they came in the next day after like a scheduled encounter, how could they, like, what data would we need to capture as part of that? And the next one is like looking at the possibilities. So at the moment, we're just assuming that all the subjects are on the same path effectively, and only differentiated maybe placebo versus active compound. But it is quite possible in a lot of studies, sort of very early on, where there's actually slightly different subject paths depending on what you're associated with. So that's another opportunity to look at, and that's kind of what this project's about. But I'm going to focus on one particular thing that we've done here. So one of the things we want to be able to do is we want to be able to like find the data itself. And the way we've done that is we've used this concept of a trigger event in terms of these things are quite commonly understood within a clinical study. So it's basically a pivot point where things happen relative to that pivot point. So in the case of research, obviously, there's a couple of things you might want to look at. The first use of study intervention is obviously very important. So you can make a statement on like the before and the after based on the fact you know that they've taken the intervention as an example. So the first use of study intervention is an example of a trigger event. Subject randomization in terms of the point at which you've decided that they are going to move forward into the study. Data-informed consent is another one. One of the things that is quite sort of like pragmatically applied is there's like an assessment of the quality of site engagement by looking at the like when things happen, like they're supposed to happen like at a different time. So Hugh showed this yesterday in terms of this is our index event here. There's visit 3, but there's a visit that happens 2 weeks before that, which is like your screening visit, and then there's like a baseline visit, and this is part of a baseline as well. So we want to be able to implement that. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to use the related action predicates to define the relationship between the encounters. So here is an example. So this is our trigger point. We use the related action and the predicate, which tells us whether something is before and after, to effectively define offsets between these events. And the offsets themselves can actually are done using a range. In this case here, they're quite symmetric. Or no, not exactly in this case. But in many cases, they're not. So it may say it can happen between 8 and 12 days after, but ideally 10 as an example. So we have that, and we can use this as a way to kind of band the data collection process. So there's kind of a step through. So we want to find the study, we want to iterate over the actions to identify the target actions based on the reference ID. We then want to find the research subject. We want to pull the patient ID from the research subject entity. Again, we don't have to actually look at the patient resource. We can just pull the patient ID and use that for all our purposes from that point forward. And then we use the ID for the target action, the patient ID, to find the care plan. And then from the care plan, we can iterate through the service request down to the encounter to identify the date of our trigger event, and then we can use the intervals to calculate the encounter windows, and then we can then use that to generate queries effectively. Now, this is a little bit different in terms of the data itself is captured totally independently and loaded as FHIR resources and put into a data set, put into a FHIR endpoint. The way we'd ideally have it is we'd actually have like kind of like we talked about in terms of the activities themselves, the observations would be associated with a procedure. But we don't have that because it was never kind of implemented that way. That's one of the things we're looking to work on at the moment. Okay, so I'm just going to step through a quick overview or implementation of this so you can see how it works. So this, I've actually there's a link in the slides of This is basically like Postman. It's a web client, but I've got essentially this. I've uploaded this collection, so it includes a pointer to the FHIR sandbox we put together for the recent connector. The first thing we want to do is obviously we want to find the research study. We can write the query, get that, and we've found that. So we know it's there. Then we want to then find from that protocol design. Same principle again. The related actions are all here, and then we want to look at this action ID, which tells us what our trigger point is and what the relationship of any of these visits are. And so some of them have like an offset range, and some of them have like 1 day. Some of them are sort of more like prescriptive and that sort of stuff. So we've done that. We can get down to a protocol design. So now we've actually understand like what our trigger point is. So we want to go and find it. The first thing we need to do is obviously find our research subject. We can do a query based on the subject ID here. And then we want to go and find for our trigger event the care plan that corresponds to that. Same principle. From that, we can get the date of the, from that we get the care plan. We go from the care plan to the service request. And the service request to the actual encounter. And then we get the date. So this is our trigger date. This is the point at which we want to define all our windows relative to that. So we can then go and look at the events or the outcomes based on that by essentially just iterating over the dates relative to our trigger date itself. So here, this is just around like day 3, for example, or visit 3, for example. We can then go and do the same thing for visit 4. We can go and see if we can find some medications. And this is really interesting because in a lot of cases, medications can actually be ones that, so there's a concept of concomitant medications which which are administered over the extent of the study. You can actually also get like ongoing medications, like prior medications. So you can see there's a lot of ones which I really, really broadly match in terms of, I think, yeah, so this one's been running since 2002. That's not ideally what we'd be looking for CONMEDs. We'd want to be able to find in CONMEDs as something that actually occurred, was given around the visit itself. So this is kind of the step down. So we're able to show that we can go from a research study through a protocol design to subject all the way to an encounter. Based on the encounter, we can then start identifying observations. And this all looks fine. And if you like looking at FHIR resources, all power to you. You can also use the same approach to actually build an algorithm. So there's also within the script and within this location a reference to a Python script which will do that. So I can then go and say, okay, I'm going to do exactly the same thing again using like the SOA FHIR instance itself. And so what it's doing here is it's scanning all the way down to find the visits and then working out the offsets and then generating the queries to go and find the relevant observations or procedures or adverse events or medication statements associated with that. As you can see here, we're able to find 41 observations that happened at visit 5, but we weren't able to find any at visit 6. So obviously it happened, but they didn't do anything. And then we can see that there were some observations that were done here. So we could infer from this that they were probably an early terminator, possibly in terms of they got to study visit 6 and then they went to retrieval, or maybe the study was shut down. So there's that, and then there's another one with slightly more examples. The thing that's really cool about this is we haven't actually, like none of these actually activities have been associated with the protocol explicitly. They exist in the EHR system. We were able to like load the planned activities, schedule of activities as FHIR resources, and then given that, we were then able to go and like find the resources that matched, which is pretty cool, I think. This looks really tedious. Jean did a nice little like React-based UI for this as part of the connected time. But again, we wanted to prove out that we could work. So the only thing we did sort of observe from this is we don't really, so in terms of, so this example here, so this is where we're assuming everything's symmetric. We have like a target date, which should be in the protocol, but there's allowance of that. And the reason you have these allowances is to be able to accommodate the case where maybe it's a public holiday, maybe a particular device or something like that you need to be able to conduct the visit at that time is out of action. So you may want to like move, sort of deviate around it. So the idea behind this is we want to be able to use these windows to define them. And the thing that we did discover is there wasn't really a good way to identify like a target date. So if we had this example of an asymmetric visit, we didn't have a way to kind of express that to say like, this would be ideal, this is okay, but this is not okay in terms of when the activities occur. So I was really pleased with that. We were able to go through and do that as part of Connect to kind of improve it all out. And we have identified an opportunity for like, or an extension we will need to add for that particular scenario. So like I said, in this case here, it's really interesting because we haven't actually specified that the outcomes of these activities are associated with a research activity itself. There's no hard binding for an observation to a procedure that's associated with the study itself. What we've done is we've basically just cast a net. We've said based on an arbitrary specification of a protocol, we've been able to then calculate all the activities based on that, and then we've been able to gather the data points that fall within those windows. This is an example of like a theoretical patient record where we have a research care plan, we have a standard care plan, and then we have just any other activities that were gathered. So ideally, we would have this, like we would be able to explicitly have all the activities associated with the care plan bound all the way down the tree, turtles all the way down, as my colleague talks about. But we can't always guarantee that. So in the cases where we don't, and this is one of the great cases for like retrospective analysis in terms of a lot of, like, one of the big focuses is being able to say, can I like create a protocol and slap it on top of an EHR system and then go and gather the data for it. And that's really important for things like data control arms, sort of control, like, you don't need to gather the cheapest data you can gather, or the most, and when I say cheap, I don't mean like cost, I mean actually like impact to people. The cheapest data you can gather is data that's already been gathered. So if you can set up a protocol, apply it to an existing data set, then you're onto a winner, basically. But what we can do is, using this approach, we can just go and gather all the data based on just the times as to when we expect to see the data. But theoretically, we should actually also be able to say, okay, only collect the data that's associated with our research protocol, because that's the only one that maybe the patient has like consented to. Okay, so some other opportunities from this. So patient recruitment is the big thing that everybody's very interested in. The schedule of activities, we haven't focused on it quite so much, and part of that's down to my like inherent biases. I have been doing some work in this in the past, both like within my company and sort of more broadly as part of some of these initiatives. There's a big thing that's used as a determinant to decide when whether a subject goes, or whether a patient becomes a participant of the study, is the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria are a set of basically bullet points in a protocol, which is what someone extremely naive would say. But they're actually a series of like really nested, really horrible conditions that have to be satisfied to like add somebody into the study. And quite often that's down to like the investigator being able to interpret that. And quite often they get changed as well. I think there's a lot of hype around the opportunity for using this approach to generate like an eligibility as a series of rules, and then use those series of rules in an EHR system to actually identify patients who would be suitable for the study. And I think it's a noble goal. I think we need to do a bit more thinking about it. Patient calendaring is one that I'm really interested in terms of a lot of these EHR systems themselves have a pretty good level of patient engagement, insofar as you have an app on your phone which tells you all the activities that you're going to be doing. If you could also include like the research activities into that, that's a huge opportunity, because the patient might know to not eat tonight because they have to have a fasting blood test tomorrow and stuff like that. And again, it's not, you're not forcing them to install another app on their phone, not forcing them to do anything like that. You're actually allowing them to just use the stuff that's already there, just like reusing and recycling the same concepts. The forecasting, again, we want to be able to like work out when things are going to happen. So the example I always use is, say, for example, you need an MRI at some point, and you know that your MRI is going to be out of action for regassing in like 18 months. What you could do is you could say, okay, I'm not going to recruit for this period of time, because I know in 18 months I'm not going to be able to do the protocol related activities. So you could do that sort of forecasting using like when you're integrated with these systems. Better costing, if we can actually identify, like, if we're at the moment the protocol has to be interpreted by us, it has to be interpreted by the sites. If we can have the protocol as basically a series of activities, then you can actually, it becomes much easier to cost some of the stuff, because you actually know, you can actually like bind them down to specific activities themselves. Remote monitoring, like obviously now, because it's going from, rather than the way it used to be, where you just basically pick up some data from one screen and put it on the next screen, where you're actually looking at sort of the workflow, it becomes much easier to do that now, to monitor that, because you're actually having an understanding of the workflow that's going on. You know what's happening. More efficient study setup, again, the activities defined once and reused many times. then you can kind of optimize your activities. And again, that's kind of these 2 points are very similar in terms of reuse is going to increase efficiency. The working group status. So we've been building out our use cases for clinical research. So we've done our plan through performed activities. We're looking now at our next 2 use cases with the view to, we want to actually have our implementation guide going out early next year. So a lot of what we've been trying to do is to work out what goes in and what goes out. I think what goes in is the stuff that we've already done. What we're trying to do at the moment is looking at what's the next steps. What are the next use cases we're going to incorporate? And we're coordinating with a lot of the Vulcan groups. I saw Scott online a wee bit earlier. There's a huge amount of crossover between us and the real-world evidence team within Vulcan. We haven't done quite so much with any of the other teams because we haven't really outlined with that just as yet. I'm not going to go through that. You can look at that at your own discretion. So we are actively looking for people to take part. So if this is your jam, and I understand if it's not, but it really should be. Research itself, I think, has always been a wee bit of a walled garden. I think there's an opportunity to kind of like smash that wall down. So if you have even a mild interest in this stuff, please come and join our group. We meet every Wednesday at about 10 o'clock Eastern. We're very interested in finding collaborators on the implementation side, partly selfishly, because obviously if we want to do an implementation guide, we have to have producers, we have to have consumers signed up. And if we don't have that, we can't get it past the approval process. So we want to basically have everybody on board to make this move forward, because again, it's one of the things, without getting too deeply into the data, it's one of the things that people will be really enabling. And yeah, come check in Zulip. We've got a Vulcan SOA group, and that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I don't think so.
Rick, are there any questions on site?
Hold on just one moment. Hi, Geoff. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sort of wondering, is there a way of, maybe could you show how you could link up the medication requests with the protocol when you want to associate the business ID of the trial with the medication for billing purposes?
When you say the medication, are you talking about like the investigational product, or are you talking about
the investigational product? Because
yeah.
you've got trials where you have an investigational product, and then you also have a standard product which wouldn't be built on the trial. So you'd always want to associate the business ID of the trial with the investigational product.
So to be perfectly honest, I think Scott would be maybe better to answer that, because they've done a lot more looking at the real world evidence side of like the actual medications themselves. To a degree, it's the idea that I've always had with these projects, with the Vulcan projects, is we're not going to solve everything in one project. So what we've been looking at is coming from the top down, and we've been kind of relying on other people to come from the bottom up in terms of like, so we'll say these are all the activities that we expect to happen, and kind of broadly this is what how we expect it to occur. We haven't really like dug in a great deal with the actual implementation of things like investigation product, how you would record that in the system. It's actually really interesting, because we had our working group meeting yesterday, and one of the use cases that was posted by the co-chair of the group was, how do we deal with IP administration? How would we actually record that within or as part of the schedule of activities itself? So I'm not like, I can find people to talk to you about that, but I'm not the best person to answer. I apologize.
Okay, so
I'll
send a message on Zulip.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thanks.
Anyone has any questions online, you can ask it in the Q&A, and we'll have Geoff keep an eye on it over the next couple of days to answer any follow-up questions. Is there anybody else on site that would like to ask a question?
I believe that's it.
Perfect.
All right.
Well, I'm glad I haven't put you to sleep, or at least I hope you haven't put you to sleep. I can't tell, but that's a win for me. Oh, there's a hand up in the chat. I don't know if it's asking for. Jason, was that a question or just a thank you?
That was a clap. Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Well,
for
thank
an
you very
amazing
much for your time.
session.
Like I said, if you are interested in taking part in the group or just understanding a bit more, get in contact with me, either like directly or through the Zulip. We can get you onto the thing. You can come along and listen. We're strongly collaborative. As you may have picked up, I tend to talk a lot, and I am trying to stop that a bit. But we recognize that the only way this problem is going to be solved is through a lot of heads, and having me sort of proselytizing about it isn't as like advantageous for it like an end goal as it could be. So if this is something you feel you're mildly interested in or something you feel very strongly about, please come along and take part. We're open to all comers. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your day.